Hello everybody, my name is Walter and this is episode 62 of my Redstone Commands Series. In this episode I want to cover how you can deal with errors, or in other words, what can you do if commands in your data packs fail. Now concerning errors, there are two different categories of programming languages. The first category raises an exception, meaning the program pauses at this point, and if you don't tell the program what is supposed to happen with a certain exception in an exception handling, then the program even terminates at this point. Other programming languages will simply ignore the error and will just continue on as if nothing happened. And Minecraft commands fall into the latter category. Nevertheless, there are three basic ways you can deal with errors in any case. The first is making sure the error doesn't happen in the first place, so you make a pre-check and prevent the error from happening. The second is handling the error when it occurs, so you detect the error and then you do something. And then the last option is correcting the consequences of an error. So if the value of a variable is not defined since the calculation wasn't run through, well, then you give it a safe value and continue as if that was the result. And with that, let's have a look at the example I prepared. So first of all, we're going to need a couple of variables. So I have a scoreboard objective here called erroring and a pseudo player dividend with 10, a divisor with 2, and a 0 with 0. Now let's just try a division of the dividend by the divisor. And if I do this, we go down to 5, then 2, then 1, and then finally 0 because it rounds down. So no real surprise there. Now let's do the same, but this time we're dividing by 0. And well, nothing happens because, well, we can't divide by 0, so the command is ignored. So what can you do? Well, you can use a function like this here, which actually does prevention as well as some handling. So let's go through this. First of all, this is using macros. So when you're calling this function, it expects an entity 1 and objective 1, which is basically the dividend. And then the same for the divisor, which is entity and objective 2. Now let's have a look at the first command in here. This command first checks whether the dividend is greater than or equal than the minimum of a scoreboard objective. May sound strange, but what I'm basically doing here is checking whether it actually exists. If that is not the case, the command would stop at this point and continue with the next line essentially. Then I'm checking whether the divisor is not 0 and at the same time also exists. And if those two checks here succeed, then I run the return run command and then finally the actual division. That way, if I can do the division, I do the division and then stop with this function here. If one of the errors has occurred, or well, would occur, so meaning either one of the dividend or divisor doesn't exist, or I'm trying to divide by 0, I continue on. So up to this point, it's pure error prevention. Now we are going into error handling. So let's detect the various error cases. First error case is checking whether we are trying to divide by 0. Same as before. And if that is the case, again, return run. And then I'm calling a function which is error message with a text error and a return fail. And this is just a tell row command with some formatting and then the text in there. And the return just returns what I tell it to. That can be quite helpful later on when you try to do error correction. So, if this is still not the case, it means that either the dividend or the divisor or even both didn't exist. So let's check for that. First, I am running the check whether the dividend exists again. And if that is the case, then it was the divisor. So I'm running a corresponding error message. Then the same in the reverse direction for this line here. And then finally, if neither of those are the case, then it must be the case that both objectives or both scores don't exist. And then I run a final failure message for that. And that is how you can make a function that not only makes sure that you're only running the command when it is valid or when you have the correct setup, but it will also give you feedback which can be extremely helpful when you want to debug and want to see where your code is misbehaving. And with that, let's actually run this function. So I am basically running the function here with entity 1 is the dividend, objective is erroring, obviously, and entity 2 is 0 erroring. And if I do this, you can see I get the error message, I tried to divide by 0. So that is error handling and also error prevention in a certain sense. But this is still not helping because the execution of the command was just suppressed, but we don't have anything else. And that is where error correction comes into play. Now for the error correction, in this case at least, I need to add another function as an intermediary between the error prevention function from before and the error correction I will talk about in a moment, because unfortunately at this moment, execute function doesn't allow for macros. So I need to turn this function here, which uses macros, into a function which doesn't have macros. So what I'm doing here is I'm calling the function error prevention save div with dividend and 0, and I'm using return run before that to make sure that the return, which can be a fail or the success of the division, is output to the actual place where I'm doing the error correction. And that then I can use with the execute unless function to make sure that if this function here fails, then I run, for example, another function, or in this case, I set the scoreboard objective, which can be basically anything, to a very high number because I'm dividing by 0, which would represent a very small number, so I'm going to a very high number. So let's see this in action. In here, I'm calling the function from before, as mentioned. And then, if that returns a fail, so I have an error, then it sets the dividend to, in this case, 1 billion even. And yeah, that is what happens here. So I'm still getting the error message from my prevention, and the dividend is set to that very high number. Now finally, I have a few more examples of error correction or cleanup that you should definitely consider to include in your code when the execution of entire functions or parts of your data pack are not guaranteed. So let's quickly go through that. One very problematic case is when you're summoning an entity, for example for recasting or other reasons, that is only meant to be temporary and is supposed to be removed after you have done whatever it was needed for. If the summon and the kill command are not in the same function, then there is a chance that the entity is summoned but not removed again. And if, let's say, this whole thing is triggered every game tick, you are summoning in 20 entities a second, and at some time this will simply kill your game. First it will lag out, and then you will likely crash the game. So in that case, make sure you either use, for example, an area effect cloud, which has an inbuilt timeout, or if you use the summon command, make sure that you add tags like, for example, temp kill me or something like that, and then later on, independent of whether this has worked or not, you have a function somewhere that is guaranteed to run and kills all entities that have this temp kill me tag. Very important to avoid lag for one and game crashes for the other. And the second example is dealing with scoreboards. So if functions don't execute, then the scoreboard objectives that were or would have been adjusted within them are obviously not. So if there are scoreboard objectives that are temporary, then you may also want to make sure that you have a function that runs a last and is guaranteed to run and just cleans up with those temporary objectives, or make sure that needed objectives exist and have a corresponding initial value. This can be done, for example, using the Minecraft load or the Minecraft tick function tags, depending on whether you want to do this only once every game reload or if you want to do this every game tick. Of course, there are also other options. But that is something I wanted to show you finally, because Especially summoning entities can very quickly kill your game, as I already mentioned. And that's already the end of this episode about dealing with errors. I hope you enjoyed it. I wish you a nice day, and well, see ya.